On the morning of January 11, 1945, a 30-year-old American pilot flying a silver fighter above the jungles of northern Luzon looked up and saw 13 enemy aircraft in formation above him. He was outnumbered more than 6 to 1. He had one wingman, no radio support, no reinforcements. And in the next 12 minutes, he would destroy 7 of those aircraft in a display of aerial combat, so overwhelming that it would rewrite the standards by which fighter pilots were measured. This is the story of the most devastating single engagement in the history of American fighter aviation. William Arthur Shomo was born in 1918 in Jeannette, Pennsylvania, a small town built on coal and steel, and the kind of stubborn American optimism that believed hard work could carry you anywhere. His father was a carpenter. His mother raised 4 children in a house where money was scarce, but ambition was not. Shomo grew up in the Great Depression, watching men who had built railways and factories lose everything, watching neighbors sell their belongings for groceries, watching the slow collapse of the world his parents had promised him. He learned early that nothing was guaranteed, that you earned what you got. That survival meant being tougher, smarter, and more prepared than the man standing next to you. He was not a dreamer. He was a mechanic. By the time he was 20, he was working in a garage in western Pennsylvania, rebuilding engines, diagnosing problems that left other mechanics baffled, earning a reputation as someone who could fix anything if you gave him the tools and the time. He understood machines the way some men understood horses or cards. Intuitively, completely. He could hear when a timing belt was off by a fraction of a second. He could feel when a carburetor was starving for air. And when the war came, when the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, William Shomo knew exactly what he was going to do. He enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces in early 1942, not because he believed in glory or because he wanted to be a hero, but because he understood machines, and because the Army needed pilots, and because sitting out the war in a Pennsylvania garage while other men fought felt like cowardice. He went through basic training in Texas, advanced training in Arizona, and by the time he earned his wings in 1943, he had logged more hours in a cockpit than most men twice his age. He was calm under pressure. He was methodical. He did not panic, and the Army, recognizing these qualities, assigned him to Reconnaissance. It was not the assignment he wanted. Reconnaissance pilots flew unarmed or lightly armed aircraft deep into enemy territory, photographing airfields and supply routes and troop movements, gathering intelligence that would be analyzed by men in distant headquarters who would never see combat. It was vital work. It was also profoundly frustrating work for a man who had spent 2 years learning how to dogfight, how to lead a target, how to turn inside an enemy aircraft and bring guns to bear in the half-second before the enemy could react. Shomo flew reconnaissance missions over New Guinea, over the Bismarck Sea, over the northern coast of occupied Indonesia. He logged hundreds of hours. He took thousands of photographs. He saw enemy aircraft dozens of times, distant shapes on the horizon that his orders forbade him from engaging. And every time he returned to base, he felt the same quiet, corrosive frustration of a man who had been trained for war, but was being used as a camera. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a tipping point. American forces had retaken the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, who had fled the islands in 1942 under orders from President Franklin Roosevelt, had returned in October, waiting ashore at Leyte with photographers capturing the moment for history. The Japanese, stretched across an empire that spanned from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, were losing. They were losing pilots faster than they could train replacements. They were losing ships faster than they could build them. They were losing territory that they had held for 3 years, falling back island by island, ridge by ridge, dying in numbers that would have been unthinkable in 1941. But they were not surrendering. Japanese doctrine, shaped by centuries of Bushido tradition and reinforced by a military culture that viewed capture as the ultimate dishonor, demanded resistance to the death. And so the war continued, grinding forward with a brutality that shocked even the men who had fought since the beginning. In the Philippines, Japanese forces had retreated into the mountains of northern Luzon, consolidating around strongpoints, preparing for a defense that would cost the Americans thousands of lives. The Imperial Japanese Army still controlled significant portions of the island. They still had aircraft. They still had supplies moving along jungle roads under cover of darkness. And the American command, determined to cut off those supplies and isolate the remaining Japanese forces, needed intelligence. They needed reconnaissance. They needed pilots like William Shomo. But by January 1945, Shomo was no longer flying the slow, vulnerable aircraft that had defined his first 2 years of war. His unit, the 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, had recently been re-equipped with the F-6D Mustang, a reconnaissance variant of the legendary P-51D fighter. The Mustang was one of the finest aircraft of the war. It was fast, capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. It was maneuverable, able to outturn almost any enemy fighter at high altitude. It was heavily armed, equipped with 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, capable of firing over 3,000 rounds per minute. And it had range, able to fly deep into enemy territory and return without refueling. For reconnaissance work, the Mustang was overkill. For a pilot who had spent 2 years dodging enemy fighters instead of engaging them, it was everything William Shomo had been waiting for. On the morning of January 11, 1945, Shomo and his wingman, First Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb, were briefed for a routine reconnaissance mission over northern Luzon. The target area was the Cagayan Valley, a long, narrow corridor of rice fields and jungle that ran south from the northern coast toward the central highlands. Japanese forces were known to be operating in the valley. Supply convoys had been spotted moving at dawn and dusk. American intelligence wanted photographs. They wanted confirmation of troop movements. They wanted targets for the heavy bombers that were hammering Japanese positions across the island. Shomo and Lipscomb were ordered to fly north at low altitude, photograph anything of value, and return. It was the kind of mission Shomo had flown 100 times. Routine, low risk, unlikely to produce contact with enemy aircraft. They took off just after dawn, 2 silver Mustangs lifting into a sky that was clear and blue and cold at altitude. They flew north, staying low, following the terrain, hugging the valleys and ridgelines that would keep them off Japanese radar. Reconnaissance doctrine emphasized stealth over speed. The goal was to see without being seen, to gather intelligence and escape before the enemy could react. Shomo and Lipscomb flew in loose formation, Lipscomb offset to the right and slightly behind, scanning the sky while Shomo focused on the ground below. The jungle was dense, unbroken except for narrow trails and the occasional clearing where Japanese troops had carved out defensive positions. They flew for 30 minutes without incident. The radios were silent. The sky was empty. And then, at approximately 10,000 feet above them, William Shomo saw the enemy. 13 aircraft, flying in formation, heading south. He counted them twice to be certain. 13. A bomber formation, he thought at first, heavy and slow and vulnerable. But as he climbed for a better angle, as the distance closed and the shapes resolved into distinct silhouettes, he realized what he was looking at. 12 fighters, 1 bomber. The fighters were Nakajima Kai-43 Hayabusa aircraft, known to the Americans as Oscars, single-engine interceptors that were fast and light and deadly in the hands of an experienced pilot. The bomber was a Mitsubishi Ki-51, a light attack aircraft used for ground support and reconnaissance. They were flying in a tight defensive formation, the fighters stacked in layers around the bomber, scanning for threats. But they were scanning above and behind. They were not scanning below. Shomo did not hesitate. He did not call for reinforcements. He did not break off to reassess the situation. He had been waiting 2 years for this moment. He had logged over 1,000 hours in a cockpit. He had trained for exactly this scenario, outnumbered, outgunned, fighting against an enemy that had been killing American pilots since 1941. And he had one critical advantage, that the Japanese did not know he possessed. Altitude. In aerial combat, altitude is energy. Altitude is speed. Altitude is life. The pilot with the height advantage can choose when and where to attack. He can dive, building speed, bringing guns to bear before the enemy can react. He can break off, climbing back to safety if the engagement turns against him. The Japanese formation was at 10,000 feet, cruising, confident, unaware. Shomo and Lipscomb were at 2,000 feet, invisible against the jungle below, with 8,000 feet of potential energy waiting to be converted into speed and violence. Shomo keyed his radio. He told Lipscomb what they were going to do. They were going to climb. They were going to position themselves behind and below the Japanese formation. And then they were going to attack, hitting the rearmost fighters first, collapsing the formation from the outside in, using speed and surprise to offset the numerical disadvantage. Lipscomb acknowledged. He did not question the plan. He did not suggest they break off and report the sighting to headquarters. He simply moved into position and prepared to follow Shomo into combat. They climbed. Shomo pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Merlin engine respond, feeling the acceleration press him back into his seat. The altimeter wound upward, 3,000 feet, 4,000, 5. The air grew colder, the sky grew darker, and the Japanese formation, still unaware, flew on. At 8,000 feet, Shomo leveled off. He was behind the formation now, trailing by perhaps a mile, positioned perfectly for the attack he had been planning since the moment he spotted them. He scanned the formation one last time, identifying targets, calculating angles, running through the mechanics of the engagement in his mind. Then he nosed over and dove. The Mustang accelerated instantly. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour, past 350, past 400. The engine roared. The wings shook, and the Japanese formation, still in tight defensive alignment, grew larger in his gun sight with every second. Shomo picked his first target, a Ki-43 on the left side of the formation, trailing slightly, exposed. He centered the gun sight. He waited until the range closed to 300 yards, close enough that he could see the individual panels on the enemy aircraft. Close enough that missing would be almost impossible. And then he fired. The 650 caliber machine guns opened up in unison, each gun spitting out 10 rounds per second, the tracers arcing across the sky in a stream of fire that converged on the Japanese fighter. The effect was instantaneous. The Ki-43 staggered as if struck by an invisible fist. Pieces flew off the fuselage. Smoke poured from the engine. And then, 3 seconds after Shomo opened fire, the aircraft exploded. Not a small explosion, not a fire that spread slowly. A catastrophic detonation that ripped the fighter apart in midair, scattering debris across the sky, leaving nothing but a fireball and a plume of black smoke falling toward the jungle below. The Japanese formation broke. They scattered in every direction, fighters peeling off left and right, diving, climbing, trying to locate the threat, trying to understand what had just killed one of their own. But they were too slow. Shomo was already moving to his second target. He pulled out of the dive, bleeding off speed, hauling the Mustang into a climbing turn that brought him up and behind another Ki-43 that was attempting to climb away. He fired again. Another burst. Another explosion. The second fighter came apart in the air, wings folding, fuselage tumbling, the pilot never getting the chance to eject or turn or fight back. 2 kills in 15 seconds. Behind Shomo, Paul Lipscomb had entered the fight. He had followed Shomo down, matching his dive, and now he opened fire on a third Ki-43 that had broken left, trying to escape. Lipscomb's gunnery was precise, controlled, the kind of shooting that came from hundreds of hours of practice and a calm that did not waver under pressure. The Japanese fighter took hits along the wing root, the engine cowling, the cockpit. It rolled inverted and fell, trailing smoke. The pilot slumped forward against the instrument panel. 3 down, 10 remaining. The engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds, and already the Japanese formation was in chaos. The remaining fighters were scattered across 5,000 feet of vertical airspace, some diving for the jungle, some climbing desperately for altitude, some turning back toward the Americans in a last attempt to mount a counterattack. The bomber, slow and exposed, was attempting to escape to the north, its pilot pushing the throttle to maximum, praying that distance would save him. Shomo did not let him escape. He had seen what Japanese bombers could do, seen the destruction they brought to American positions, seen the craters and the bodies and the shattered equipment left behind after a successful strike. He pulled the Mustang around in a tight turn, ignoring the G-forces that pressed him down into his seat, ignoring the black edges creeping into his vision, focusing entirely on the bomber that was now less than a mile ahead and descending. He closed the distance in seconds. The bomber crew must have seen him coming. They must have known they were going to die. But they did not surrender. They did not bail out. They kept flying, kept trying to reach safety, kept believing in a miracle that was not going to come. Shomo opened fire from 400 yards, raking the bomber from tail to nose, the .50 caliber rounds punching through the thin aluminum skin, tearing apart the engine, the fuel tanks, the cockpit. The bomber shuddered, nosed over and went down hard, crashing into the jungle in a spray of dirt and debris. 4 down. Shomo pulled up, scanning for the next target. The sky was full of contrails and smoke and desperate Japanese pilots who were now fully aware that they were being slaughtered. One Ki-43, more aggressive or more experienced than the others, had managed to position itself for a head-on attack. It was diving toward Shomo, guns blazing, the pilot gambling that a frontal engagement would rattle the American, would force him to break off, would give the remaining Japanese fighters time to regroup. It was a fatal miscalculation. Head-on engagements were a test of nerve and gunnery, and William Shomo had both in abundance. He did not flinch. He did not break. He flew straight at the oncoming fighter, adjusted his aim to account for the closure rate, and fired. The Ki-43 flew directly into the stream of bullets. The cockpit disintegrated. The engine seized. And the fighter, now pilotless, flipped over and tumbled past Shomo's wing, missing him by less than 50 feet. 5 down. The remaining Japanese fighters were running. They had abandoned any attempt at cohesion, any hope of mounting a coordinated defense. They were diving for the jungle, trying to use the terrain to break visual contact, trying to reach the safety of their own airfields where anti-aircraft guns and reinforcements might save them. Shomo picked one that was diving steeply to the east, already below 5,000 feet, the pilot pushing the aircraft to its structural limits in a desperate bid for survival. Shomo followed him down. The pursuit was vertical, both aircraft screaming toward the jungle at speeds that would have torn apart earlier fighters. Shomo stayed behind and above, correcting for the target's evasive maneuvers, waiting for the moment when the Japanese pilot would have to pull out of the dive or crash. That moment came at 2,000 feet. The Ki-43 leveled off sharply, the pilot pulling back hard on the stick, the wings bending under the G-load. Shomo fired. The fighter exploded, the fuel tanks igniting, the wreckage cartwheeling across the treetops before slamming into the jungle floor. 6 down. Shomo pulled up, his airspeed dangerously low, his altitude critically low, the jungle canopy rushing past just beneath his wings. He scanned the sky. He could see Lipscomb to the west, pursuing another Ki-43. He could see smoke trails marking the locations where aircraft had gone down. And he could see one more target, a lone Ki-43 fleeing south at maximum speed. The pilot undoubtedly convinced that he was the only survivor, that everyone else was dead. Shomo went after him. The chase covered 15 miles. The Japanese pilot was good. He stayed low, hugging the terrain, using the hills and valleys to mask his position, jinxing left and right to spoil Shomo's aim. But the Mustang was faster. Shomo closed the gap steadily, inexorably, until the Ki-43 was within range. He fired a short burst, missed, adjusted, fired again. This time the rounds found their mark, stitching across the fuselage, severing control cables, destroying the rudder. The Ki-43 rolled hard to the left, completely out of control, and slammed into the side of a hill in a fireball that was visible for miles. 7 down. Shomo climbed back to altitude, his hands steady on the controls, his breathing controlled, his mind already running through the post-combat checklist. He had expended over 2,000 rounds of ammunition. His fuel was lower than he would have liked, and he needed to link back up with Lipscomb before they started the return flight to base. He keyed the radio, calling for his wingman. Lipscomb responded immediately. He had downed 3 Japanese fighters. He was undamaged. He was ready to go home. They formed up and turned south, 2 silver Mustangs flying low over the jungle, leaving behind the wreckage of 10 Japanese aircraft scattered across 50 square miles of northern Luzon. The engagement had lasted 12 minutes from the first kill to the last. 12 minutes in which William Shomo had destroyed 7 enemy aircraft and Paul Lipscomb had destroyed 3. 10 confirmed kills. 0 American losses. It was the kind of engagement that happened once in a war, if that. The kind that would be studied in tactical manuals and debated in officers' clubs for decades. The kind that separated good pilots from legends. As they approached their home airfield at Lingian, Shomo and Lipscomb did something that was officially discouraged but universally understood. They rolled their aircraft. Victory rolls, they were called. Aerial maneuvers that announced to everyone on the ground that the returning pilots had scored kills. 1 roll per kill. Standard practice. Shomo rolled 7 times. Lipscomb rolled 3. And on the ground, mechanics and pilots and support personnel stopped what they were doing and counted the rolls and tried to process what they were seeing. 7 rolls, 7 kills in 1 mission. It was impossible. It had to be a mistake. Maybe Shomo was counting damaged aircraft. Maybe he was exaggerating for effect. But when the Mustangs landed and taxied to their revetments, when the ground crews swarmed over the aircraft and saw the gun barrels still hot, the empty ammunition cans, the camera footage that documented every kill, the skepticism evaporated. It was real, all of it. 10 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 7 by Shomo, 3 by Lipscomb. And the camera footage, grainy black and white film shot from the gun cameras mounted in the Mustang's nose, left no room for doubt. The footage showed the bomber exploding. It showed fighters disintegrating under sustained fire. It showed the chaos and violence of an engagement that had unfolded faster than most men could react. The debriefing took hours. Intelligence officers interrogated Shomo and Lipscomb, demanding details, cross-referencing their accounts against the camera footage, mapping the locations where aircraft had gone down. Pilots from other squadrons crowded into the briefing room, listening in silence as Shomo described the engagement with the same calm, methodical precision he used to rebuild engines. He did not boast. He did not exaggerate. He simply recounted what had happened, step by step, kill by kill, as if he were describing a training exercise rather than one of the most remarkable aerial combats in history. By the end of the day, the story had spread across the entire airfield. By the end of the week, it had reached General MacArthur's headquarters in Manila. By the end of the month, it was being reported in American newspapers, radio broadcasts, newsreels shown in theaters from New York to Los Angeles. William Shomo, the mechanic from Pennsylvania, the reconnaissance pilot who had spent 2 years photographing enemy positions, had become a national hero overnight. The United States Army Air Forces moved quickly to recognize the significance of what had occurred. On February 7, 1945, less than a month after the engagement, it was announced that Captain William A. Shomo would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration that could be bestowed upon an American serviceman. The citation, read aloud at the presentation ceremony, detailed the action over Luzon and emphasized not just the number of kills but the audacity of the attack, the skill required to achieve such a lopsided victory, and the importance of the intelligence that had been gathered before the engagement began. The Medal of Honor was not given for kills alone. It was given for valor, for actions that went beyond the call of duty, for moments when a soldier faced impossible odds and acted anyway. Shomo's engagement met every criterion. He had been outnumbered 6-1. He had attacked without hesitation, without reinforcements, without any guarantee of survival. He had executed the attack with a level of skill that bordered on artistry. And he had achieved results that would have seemed like fiction if they had not been documented on film. Paul Lipscomb received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration, for his role in the engagement. His 3 kills were significant accomplishments in their own right, and his decision to follow Shomo into combat without hesitation had been critical to the success of the mission. Together, they had destroyed nearly an entire Japanese formation, a feat that would have required an entire squadron under normal circumstances. But the story of January 11, 1945, was not just about medals and recognition. It was about what that engagement represented. By early 1945, the United States had been at war for over 3 years. American pilots had been flying combat missions since the desperate early days after Pearl Harbor, when Japanese aircraft dominated the Pacific skies and American forces were retreating on every front. Those early pilots had flown outdated aircraft against superior numbers, suffered catastrophic losses, and died by the hundreds in battles that history would barely remember. They had bought time. Time for American industry to retool, for new aircraft to be designed and built, for new pilots to be trained. And by 1945, that investment was paying off. The F-6D Mustang that William Shomo flew on January 11 was the product of that investment. It was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything the Japanese could field. It gave American pilots an edge that could turn even a seemingly impossible engagement into a decisive victory. But the aircraft alone was not enough. The edge had to be used. The pilot had to recognize the opportunity, make the decision to attack, and execute with a level of precision that left no room for error. William Shomo did all of that, and in doing so, he demonstrated what American pilots were capable of when training, equipment, and courage converged in the same moment. The engagement was studied extensively after the war. Tactical analysts examined the gun camera footage frame by frame, reconstructing the sequence of events, identifying the decisions that had led to success. Flight instructors used the engagement as a teaching tool, showing new pilots how to exploit altitude advantage, how to manage ammunition, how to maintain situational awareness in a chaotic multi-aircraft engagement. And historians, writing decades later, would identify the action over northern Luzon as one of the most one-sided aerial victories of World War II, comparable to the achievements of the most celebrated aces in American, British, and German service. William Shomo did not become a household name in the way that some aces did. He did not have the flamboyant personality of a Gregory Boyington or the tragic death of a Richard Baum. He was quiet, reserved, uncomfortable with fame. After the medal ceremony, he returned to duty, flying reconnaissance missions over Luzon and Formosa until the end of the war. He logged over 1,500 combat hours by the time Japan surrendered in August 1945. He survived the war without serious injury, without being shot down, without the trauma that left so many combat pilots unable to fly after they returned home. When the war ended, Shomo stayed in the military. He transferred to the newly created United States Air Force in 1947, serving as a test pilot and instructor, passing on the lessons he had learned over the Pacific to a new generation of pilots who would fight in Korea and Vietnam. He flew jets, mastering the new technology with the same methodical precision he had used to master piston-engine fighters. He trained younger pilots, teaching them not just how to fly but how to think in combat, how to stay calm under pressure, how to make decisions in the seconds between life and death. And he never spoke much about January 11, 1945. It was a day, one mission in a war that had consumed years of his life. He retired from the Air Force in 1968 as a colonel, having served for over a quarter of a century, having flown nearly every aircraft in the American inventory, having trained hundreds of pilots who would go on to their own combat missions. He settled in Florida, far from the Pennsylvania town where he had grown up, far from the jungles of Luzon where he had earned his place in history. He lived quietly, rarely giving interviews, rarely attending reunions, content to let his record speak for itself. William A. Shomo died on May 25, 1990, at the age of 71. His obituary ran in newspapers across the country, most of them leading with the same detail. 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed in 12 minutes, a Medal of Honor, a legend. But to understand the significance of what happened on January 11, 1945, you have to look beyond the numbers, beyond the kills and the medals and the headlines. You have to understand that in war, moments like that are vanishingly rare. Most combat is chaos. Most pilots never see the enemy. Most missions end without shots fired, without contact, without anything to show for hours of flying except fatigue and the knowledge that you survived one more day. William Shomo flew hundreds of those missions, hundreds of hours over enemy territory, watching, waiting, photographing, surviving. And then, on one clear January morning, everything aligned. The Japanese made a mistake. They flew in formation, unaware, exposed. Shomo had the altitude, the aircraft, the ammunition, the skill, and the nerve to exploit that mistake. And in 12 minutes he achieved what most pilots dream about and never experience. He had perfect conditions, perfect execution, perfect results, 7 kills, no losses, the kind of engagement that becomes legend because it represents the absolute upper limit of what one pilot can accomplish in combat. And that is why the story matters. Not because William Shomo was superhuman, not because he had abilities that other pilots lacked, but because he was prepared. Because when the moment came, he did not hesitate. He did not second guess. He did not let fear or doubt or the numerical odds stop him from acting. He flew into combat outnumbered and emerged victorious because he had spent years learning how to do exactly that. Because skill, when combined with opportunity, can overcome odds that seem impossible. Because preparation matters. Because training matters. Because the difference between survival and death in combat often comes down to the decisions you make in the seconds before the shooting starts. January 11, 1945, was not just a remarkable day for William Shomo. It was a demonstration of what the American military had become by the final year of World War II. A force equipped with the best technology in the world, trained to the highest standards, led by men who understood that victory required not just courage but competence. The Japanese formation that Shomo destroyed that morning represented the opposite trajectory. Pilots with inadequate training flying outdated aircraft, operating under a doctrine that prioritized aggression over survival, serving a military command that had already lost the war but refused to admit it. The engagement was a microcosm of the larger conflict, one side ascending, one side collapsing, and in the middle, men like William Shomo doing the work that would end the war. The story of that engagement has been told many times over the past 8 decades. It has appeared in books, documentaries, magazine articles, and now here in this retelling. And every time it is told, the same details emerge. 13 aircraft, 10 kills, 12 minutes, a Medal of Honor. The numbers never change because they are grounded in records that cannot be disputed. Gun camera footage, debriefing transcripts. Wreckage found and cataloged by American forces after they secured northern Luzon. The story is true, all of it, and that is what makes it so compelling. In an age where aerial combat has changed beyond recognition, where pilots fight with missiles launched from beyond visual range, where dogfights are rare and air superiority is established by technology rather than skill, the story of William Shomo feels almost mythological. A man in a machine, flying low over enemy territory, spotting the enemy by chance, climbing into position, and then diving into combat with nothing but his training and his nerve to guide him. No computers. No targeting systems. No backup. Just a pilot and a fighter in the sky. That is the world William Shomo fought in. That is the world he mastered. And on one January morning in 1945, he proved that even in war, even in chaos, even when outnumbered and alone, one person with the right skills and the right mindset can change the outcome of a battle in minutes. If you found this story as gripping as I did, please consider subscribing to this channel for more deep dives into the extraordinary moments of military history. Hit the like button if you think Captain Shomo's achievement deserves to be remembered. And let me know in the comments, what do you think was the most critical factor in his success that day? Was it the aircraft, the training, the altitude advantage, or something else entirely? I would love to hear your thoughts.